Early March 1943, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Cold metal kissed by humid air, and a wrench slipped from oil-stained hands as Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stood very still and stared at the airplane before him. A B-25 Mitchell that had been made into something the manuals did not allow and the generals had not sanctioned, something that looked to the tidy logic of regulations like an act of madness. Where a bombardier's glass nose should have sat there, now protruded 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, mouths of iron that made the bomber look less like a measured instrument of strategic bombing and more like a prowling beast of the sea, a ship killer that had been welded together in the back rooms of desperation and private rage, a commerce destroyer born of anger and necessity that might save the Pacific Theater or might send Paul Gunn to a court-martial and disgrace, and no one could know which until the first mission, until the math of victory was forced, not by staff plans in Washington, but in welding shops, in maintenance hangars, by this 43-year-old maverick who had decided vengeance could be folded into ingenuity. He had been fighting his own private war for 2 long years, a voyage that started on December 8, 1941, Manila time, when Paul Irvin Gunn, known to no one as Pappy yet, had watched from Nichols Field, while Japanese bombers methodically unmade the American Air Forces in the Philippines, his life before the war collapsing like a brittle paper map in a rainstorm, and leaving him with oil under his fingernails and a furnace of fury in his chest. He had been manager of a fledgling Philippine Airlines, with 4 Red Beach 18 civilian craft under his command, small things that morning in the face of the roaring wings of the enemy. Yet within hours, Major General Louis Brereton would commandeer those airplanes and commission gun as a captain in the Army Air Forces, and what should have been a brief wartime service hardened into a 3-year odyssey of improvisation, invention, and personal vendetta. He was 42 when war found him again, a former Navy chief petty officer, an enlisted naval aviator who had ridden the air across the 1920s, taught at Pensacola, served with the top hatters, and learned aircraft not from manuals, but from 2 decades of hands-on labor, fixing a stubborn carburetor by feel, coaxing engines to life with a mechanic's patience, counting rivets as if they were prayers. And so, he knew a plane's bones the way other men know family lines. But technical mastery was a cold comfort when family lay behind enemy lines. His wife, Clarissa Louise, Polly DeFriends, and their 4 children were in Manila as the Japanese closed like a gray tide. And on Christmas Eve, 1941, Paul received orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He drew every dollar he had, borrowed what he could from comrades, and obeyed, because orders were the thin scaffolding that held an army together, because the war was bigger than one family. But the city moved faster than his plans, and his family could not reach the airstrip. And soon, Polly and the children were rounded up and taken to the University of Santo Tomas, converted by the occupiers into an internment camp for enemy civilians. That moment was a hinge in Gunn's life, the soft snapping of a man who had kept his rage coiled and useful until now. And when the news came, something inside him broke open and poured out into a decision. If he could not protect them by presence, he would do it by accelerating the end of the war, by making the sea an unlivable place for the ships that kept the Japanese machine fed. So he turned his grief into a tool, into a plan that would look ugly to the eyes of regulation, but elegant to the eyes of survival. When he flew into Bataan to deliver medical supplies through lethal airspace on a mission that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross, the medal did not soothe him. It sharpened his intent. He would find a way to take ships down. He would make the Japanese pay for every day his family spent behind barbed wire. In Brisbane in July 1942, Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, who, like Gunn, had a mind that liked to bend the rules in the name of effectiveness, arrived to command Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific and found a theater in disarray, morale thin, equipment scarce, the Japanese dominating the air over New Guinea and threatening Australia itself. General MacArthur's fury was as much public theater as it was private disappointment. Kenney listened to the scolding and then asked, quietly, for the authority to replace what he called deadwood, the stagnant officers whose caution had calcified into failure. MacArthur, surprised but pragmatic, agreed, and Kenney reshaped his command, bringing in audacity where there had been timidity, setting up forward headquarters in New Guinea, and choosing men willing to take risks. But men alone do not sink ships. Ideas do, and Kenney had been thinking for years about skip bombing, a tactic that read like a child's game. Release bombs low so they would skip across the water's skin like stones and strike the hull below the armor line. But execution demanded aircraft that could come in low, fast, and suppress the flak and the crew that tended it. High-altitude bombing had been a poor surgeon's stroke against maneuvering convoys, and B-17s from altitude were luck more than skill, landing less than 1% of their bombs on target when ships could move and dodge. Then Kenny discovered gun, and everything shifted. Someone in the 3rd Attack Group had been illegally modifying planes, taking out the bombardier's glass nose and pushing in gunners and guns, and the idea, crude at first, was brutally practical. The B-25 Mitchell was redesigned not by committee, but by a man who had nothing left to lose, who scavenged Boeing-50s from wrecked fighters and welded them where the airframe would bear the al-Safeh stress. Where doctrine said no, experience said yes. Captain Paul Gunn, working alone, became a crucible where desperation and innovation melted into something that spoke the language of survival. The B-25's transformation into a strafing, low-level attacker was not elegant. It was a handmade weapon of retribution, a machine that breathed in the right rhythm for the Pacific's narrow seas. The bomber, intended for medium-altitude precision, now wore forward-firing guns like a naval destroyer's broadside, and that change altered the geometry of conflict. No longer were planes simply dropping ordnance from the heavens. Now they could steam in low, strobe across the water, cut the engine's rhythm of an enemy convoy with torrents of lead, and make ships that had thought themselves safe in night and storm count losses in new ways. There was an intimacy, and an intimacy's terror in that kind of attack. You flew low enough to feel the spray, low enough that the sound of your own guns came back to you like the echo of a bell, startling, final. Kenny's tactical mind, honed by years of unorthodox thought, saw the potential. He sanctioned experiments, nurtured improvisation, and when he learned of guns' modifications, he did not reach for the regulations book. He reached for operational advantage. The Pacific Theater was a place where the map, stretched thin between islands and supply convoys, threaded the vulnerable lines. The mathematics of victory here were not only about ships and planes, but about the cargo that kept armies alive: ammo, fuel, food, and hope. Allied bombing that failed to stop resupply was an arithmetic problem with deadly consequences. If you could not block the flow of materiel, you could not stop the fight. And so the modified Mitchells, ugly, lethal, and unauthorized on paper, became a part of a larger creative machine, a mosaic of stopgap solutions welded together by necessity. Gunn's work was not only mechanical, it was moral for him. An attempt to convert personal anguish into a force that might pry loose a moment when his family could be safe. He did not tell many. He did not need to. The hangar's whisper was enough. Men who had seen enough death understood the currency of quiet audacity. His past, 2 decades of naval aviation, teaching in the old days, repairing, crashing, always getting back in the cockpit, gave him a patience for trial and error, for fingers learning the stubborn language of rivets and controls. He had flown the old biplanes when the sky was a young thing and learned to read a machine's complaint as if it were a human's sigh. He brought that tacit knowledge to the problem of killing ships and ended up building something the textbooks called illegal, but the men in the field called necessary. Around him, the theater groaned, pilots short of combat experience, crews exhausted, engineers improvising parts with tin snips and faith. The Japanese, meanwhile, still ruled many of the routes, and their convoys were the lifeblood of positions wedged into New Guinea's clutches. If a man on an island could not be fed, he could not hold, and Gunn understood, painfully, that the calculus of survival in the Southwest Pacific came back again and again to whether ships could slip through at dusk and dawn. So he welded and bolted and tested until the B-25's iron face became a tool of vengeance. And when the planes that carried his compound designs tilted low over black water and let rip with coordinated strafes and bombs that skipped, the geometry of the night changed. Suddenly convoys that had moved like fishes in the dark were hulks, listless, burning, and the math of supply shifted. It was ugly, it was noisy, and it was deeply human. The sound of men's anger made mechanical. The weight of a father's fear turned into a flight path. And as the first runs proved effective, as the proof piled up in the logs, and in the pale-eyed reports from crews who had seen freighters disintegrate in black water, the unauthorized became indispensable. The line between legality and necessity blurred into insignificance. The transformation that had its roots in one man's private fury, Paul Gunn's, would ripple outward and become part of the larger strategy that, stitched with other improvisations, began to choke the sea lanes that fed Japanese resistance in New Guinea and beyond. And the world, which had looked for victory in grand plans and named battles, would also have to learn to read the small, stubborn acts carried out in shadowed hangars where a wrench can fall and a man can make a choice that bends history. Then, in the humid dark, a plane's engine coughed, spooled, and the first shot rang like a photograph being taken, sharp and final, a single sound that would be remembered as the moment the quiet turned to consequence. The wrench slipped from oil-stained hands as Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stood very still and stared at the airplane before him. He had taught himself aircraft modification through trial and error, no formal engineering degree tucked in any pocket, but 20 years of hands-on work had taught him the shapes and stresses of airframes, the secret grammar of weight distribution, and the blunt, unforgiving reality of weapons systems. And that practical knowledge now sat like a second skin around his shoulders as he considered what he had done and what his commanders now demanded. Most officers would have been court-martialed for modifying military aircraft without authorization, and Gunn understood that fully, yet necessity and the private fire in his chest had pushed him into the hangar's shadow, into the humming, grease-scented world where rules are rewritten with a blowtorch and a prayer. When General Kenny, practical, impatient, and unafraid of bold fixes, saw what Gunn could do, he did not reach for a manual. He placed him on his personal staff as a special projects officer and gave him an impossible mission. Modify every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack and do it immediately. The order read like a demand for miracles, but Gunn answered with the only language he knew: work. He put in 18-hour days, scrounging weapons from crashed fighters like a man gathering kindling for a fire, fabricating mounting brackets in makeshift workshops that smelled of hot metal and linseed oil, and then, when the parts were bolted and the rivets dimmed in the torchlight, he climbed into the cockpit and test flew each modified machine himself, because no blueprint could replace a man's feel for how an airplane should breathe. He added 4 50-caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted additional weapons along the fuselage, and installed bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. Simple phrases on paper, but monstrous in practice. Each change shifting balance, changing stresses, demanding reinforcement, demanding patience and exactness. The modified A-20s, Strafer A-20s as crews would later call them, went into combat in September 1942 and struck a Japanese airfield at Buna with results that exceeded every expectation held by comfortable staff rooms. They came in at treetop level, like ghosts over the green, guns blazing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before the defenders could fully realize what struck them. Where high-altitude bombers gave the enemy minutes to spot, vector, and respond, these low-level strikes arrived with the suddenness of a storm. The attack destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground and demonstrated that low-level strafing could, in the right hands, revolutionize air warfare in a theater where the geometry of islands and sea made conventional bombing a blunt instrument. Kenny, who had theorized skip bombing and low-level strikes for years, smelled possibility, and so he ordered Gunn to move up to the B-25 Mitchell, a larger platform with longer reach, a plane that could carry more ordnance and, if properly altered, could deliver the kind of forward firepower that might turn night supply runs and convoy crossings into costly enterprises for the enemy. The Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber, twin-engine, a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, 2 Wright R2600 radial engines, each churning out roughly beyond 700 horsepower, numbers that sound clinical and calm on a specification sheet, but, in Gunn's hands, became the bones of a new kind of predator. Normal armament had included 6 50-caliber guns scattered for defense and a respectable bomb load of up to 3,000 pounds. Its crew of 5, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner, was balanced for a mission profile the Mitchell's designers intended. But Gunn looked at that forward fuselage and saw opportunity. There was room in that nose, solidity in that steel, redundancy in twin engines. Lose one, and you did not automatically lose the bird. More important, the Mitchell's range could reach Japanese shipping lanes the smaller A-20 could not. In late 1942, Gunn began the painstaking work in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia, partnered with Captain Jack Fox from North American Aviation, a man whose job, in theory, was to ensure factory specifications were preserved. In practice, Fox became something else, co-conspirator, tacit ally in a program that would soon be the most successful, unauthorized aircraft modification of the war. The first challenge they met was simple and brutal. Remove the bombardier and his transparent nose section. That removed a vulnerable position that had no place in low-altitude combat and saved weight to be redistributed for the new role. Into that vacuum, Gunn welded a solid metal nose that housed an array of 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns that could be fired forward under pilot control. Each weapon carried 500 rounds. Each gun could chew through metal at some 850 rounds per minute, numbers that, when read aloud around a map table, induce a different kind of silence. But Gunn was not satisfied with 4 or 6. He wanted a storm. He added 2 more 50s in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, fitted just below and behind the cockpit, projecting slightly so they cleared the propeller arc and could fire without the bullets singing through their own props. Then he took the dorsal turret, twin 50s behind the cockpit that had once been swivel defense, and locked it forward, integrating it into the pilot's fire control so that the co-pilot or pilot could bring those barrels into play as part of a forward salvo. The result was an ungainly, terrifying synthesis, a medium bomber carrying the forward weight and punch of more than one fighter and still able to carry a fighting bomb load. 8 forward-firing 50s delivered a wall of lead, approximately 180 pounds of metal, flying toward a target every second when all guns spat at once. To put it plainly, Gunn turned a Mitchell into a gunship, a flying hammer that could pummel the sides of ships and strip the deck of defenders in seconds. Of course, this brute power raised engineering alarms. The nose-heavy modification shifted the center of gravity forward, making the aircraft nose-heavy and more challenging to control. Enormous recoil from 8 simultaneous guns vibrated structures and threatened to loosen more than metal. Heat and smoke pooled in the nose and cockpit, demanding ventilation and rearranged ammunition storage. Harmonization, getting all 8 barrels to converge at a useful point in front of the aircraft, was a fine art that required patience, measurement, and repeated live fire tests. Gunn developed ground testing procedures, placing targets at measured distances, 200, 300, 400 yards, and adjusted each mount minute by minute until the ballistics converged. He test-fired personally, refusing to accept a craft into service that had even the slightest scatter. The work took around 2 weeks per aircraft when done non-stop. Gunn trained maintenance crews, taught them production line techniques born of necessity, and by December 1942 had modified enough B-25s to outfit the 91st Bombardment Squadron. Theory became doctrine in fits and starts. Kenny selected Major Ed Lana, a pilot who had risen swiftly because he matched the theater's need for audacity, with the command to develop tactics for the new gunships. Lana and Gunn worked out profiles where modified B-25s would come in low, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water, at closure speeds that made range estimation by gunners nearly impossible, at perhaps 300 miles per hour, fast, low, and sudden. At that height and speed, ship gunners trained on the rhythms of planes over the horizon had little time to adjust. The closing speed was a problem of human reaction times and mechanical aiming, and the B-25s exploited that arithmetic mercilessly. Pilots would open fire at around 1,000 yards and walk the fire into the target, an old bomberman slang turned deadly technique, letting the concentrated forward fire rip across decks, superstructure, and gun positions just before the bombs were released to skip or strike the hull. The modified Mitchells carried a fragmentation and skip bombs suited to this profile, ordnance that, when coupled with suppressing forward fire, turned a convoy into a collection of vulnerable points exposed to concentrated, coordinated attack. Engineering challenges were myriad. The gun's recoil produced stress that required reinforcing the nose with additional bracing. Ammunition storage had to be vented and cooled. Smoke management needed fresh ducts to prevent blinding the crew, and the increased forward weight demanded tail ballast adjustments and repositioning of internal equipment. Yet Gunn persisted, balancing physics and fieldcraft until the planes flew with a new, terrible grace. The tactical payoff was soon evident in after-action notes and pilot debriefs. When a formation of such Mitchells dove onto a convoy, the combined firepower and bombing created chaos the Japanese had not anticipated, anti-aircraft crews suppressed, ships unable to coordinate an effective defense before damage propagated, and convoys that had once moved with confident rhythm now broke apart or burned like black flowers in the water. The innovation was not purely mechanical, it was doctrinal. Where the Allies had been trying to enforce maritime interdiction with high-altitude bombing, inefficient, forgiving to the hunted, gunships brought interdiction down into the visceral, immediate business of close-range destruction. The math of attrition in the theater began to change. Sink enough ships, and the men ashore no longer get the food, ammunition, or fuel that sustain them. Deny resupply, and positions wither not only because of enemy fire, but because the human metabolism of war, fuel, food, munitions, runs dry. Guns modifications helped convert a strategic problem into tactical solutions that piled up into operational impact. Importantly, these changes did not happen in a vacuum. They emerged from a war zone where improvisation was a skill as vital as marksmanship, where forward-thinking commanders like Kenny encouraged experiments and tacitly accepted rule-bending when it produced effect. Gunn and Fox, the technician and the representative, made a kind of compact. Industrial design theory met field necessity, and the hangars of Townsville echoed with a different sort of hymn, one of rivets, tests, calculations, and the quiet satisfaction of a job that, when done right, saved lives. There is a human side to this mechanized story, too. Gunn's personal sorrow, his wife and children interned, was not an incidental detail, but a moral engine. He did not pursue modification for glory or for academic curiosity, but because urgency made small injustices unbearable. He welded and measured and flew with the intimacy of a man who wanted the war ended sooner, who needed supply chains choked so that the enemies holding his family could be unmoored. Yet he was not alone in this. The theater's need produced many such ugly, brilliant inventions, stopgap solutions that worked because men on the spot were willing to take responsibility for outcomes rather than wait for permission from distant headquarters. The modified B-25s, the Strafer A-20s, and the creative use of ammunition and ordnance were small threads in a larger tapestry, a collection of practical answers that, when woven together, tightened the noose around convoys and supply runs, and made the ocean a narrower place for those who would feed a distant army. When crews returned from a successful run, dark water still clinging to their flaps and the taste of cordite in their mouths, the reports were direct. Ships burned that had seemed invulnerable, convoys scattered under a hail of bullets, and men who had once thought themselves safe at sea learned anew the cruelty of being surprised. The authorized and the illicit blurred into one category of truth, effectiveness. And in that humid theater where islands measured strategic distance in days and nights of travel, effectiveness was the currency of survival. Gunn's work did not look clean on any inspector's ledger. It looked ragged, bold, and perhaps illegal. But in a war that measured outcomes by who could keep men supplied and who could not, his hands-on conversions mattered. The B-25's new nose, its hard, blunt vantage of guns and steel, became a symbol of a practical innovation, dangerous, human, and, ultimately, decisive, in ways that staff rooms could no longer ignore. The hammering of rivets, the late-night testing, the pilot's wary grin after a successful run. These were the small sounds that, together, changed the map of the Pacific. And when the modified Mitchells lifted off at dusk, engines whining against the humidity, crews tightening straps and checking sights, there was always in the cockpit a human weight, the knowledge that what they carried and what they had become might change a calculation written in maps and reports and maybe bring someone home. The plane's engines picked up with a soft, purposeful roar, the sound of adaptation made airborne. The stream of 50 caliber bullets would come first, always first, like a steel broom sweeping a deck clean. Pilots described it later as watching a glowing zipper run across the enemy ship, teeth of fire opening along railings and bridge wings. That was the point of Gunn's design, not to sink the ship with gunfire, although 8 Brownings chewing at once could do ugly things to light superstructure, but to blind it, to stun it, to make every man behind an anti-aircraft site duck instead of shoot. Suppression before destruction. Terror before rupture. You silence the eyes and hands, then you kill the hull. And when that low American attack plane roared in at mast height, tracer lines skipping off spray, Japanese gunners had seconds, sometimes less than seconds, to decide whether to fire, to dive for cover, or to die standing. Most never got to choose. Then came the part that really changed Pacific naval warfare. At 200 to 400 yards out, so close you could make out ladder rungs and rigging, the pilot eased the nose the tiniest fraction, held altitude over the rough green sea, and punched the bomb release. The bomb was already traveling at roughly 300 miles an hour, borrowed speed from the Mitchell's twin radials. It smacked the water, not like a stone lazily tossed by a boy on a pond, but like a hammer on tempered glass. One hard skip, sometimes two, throwing a curtain of spray higher than a man, and then, still hot with momentum, it slammed into the ship's flank right at the line where steel meets sea. Because of the 4 to 5 second delayed fuse, there was no premature flash, no wasted blossom of fire outside the hull. The bomb bit, slid, sometimes punched through plating, dropped just below the surface, and only then, enfolded by water that could not compress, and so had to transmit its violence, did it detonate. That was the genius. Water turned the blast into a fist. A single, well-placed skip bomb below the armor belt could kink a keel, rip open fuel tanks, flood engine rooms, snap bulkheads like matchsticks. Ships are proud things, but they are proud in air. Underwater shock humbles them. And by the time the explosion went off, by the time flames and steam and blasted plating roared upward where the B-25 had just flown, Gunn's aircraft was already past, climbing hard, pilots wincing at their own concussions, engines howling to outrun secondary blasts. 10 seconds. That was all it took, from first tracer to bomb gone. 10 seconds to make or break a convoy. Skip bombing itself wasn't brand new. The British had played with it, adventurous. American pilots had tried it here and there. But to weld it together with over-the-top forward firepower, that was Paul Gunn's contribution. The Strafer nose made the bomber its own fighter escort. No longer did low-level bombers have to beg for cover while they crawled in. They brought their own hurricane of lead. In the Southwest Pacific, where Japanese ships threaded through narrow seas under cover of clouds and darkness, this mattered. While Gunn and his crews were still welding and test-firing, Allied intelligence was doing its own kind of patient work. Ultra and its Pacific cousin FRUMEL, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, had been gnawing away at Japanese naval traffic. By early 1943, those code breakers could read, sometimes the same day, what Tokyo or Rabaul was telling its commanders. Late in February, the wireless rooms in Australia began to see something big. Signals about a large convoy forming at Rabaul, ships being marshaled, escorts assigned, timetables laid down with the stiff precision of an empire sure of its reach. 8 transports, they said, headed to lay on the north coast of New Guinea. Nearly 6,900 troops, men of the veteran 51st Division. 8 destroyers for escort, fighter cover from upwards of 100 Zeros. The timing was there too. Depart Simpson Harbor at midnight, 28th February 1943. 3 days at sea. Land at Ley. Reinforce the garrisons, bleeding against Australians and Americans slogging over the Owen Stanleys. This wasn't some small Tokyo Express run. This was Japan's maximum effort to hold New Guinea. And in war, maximum efforts are bright targets. General George C. Kenney, sitting in his headquarters, saw the outline at once. If that convoy got through, the Japanese position in New Guinea would harden, costlier for Allied troops to crack. If it could be destroyed at sea, if those 6,900 men could be drowned or dispersed before they ever fired a rifle ashore, then Japan's ability to contest the Southwest Pacific would be broken in a way factories back home could never fix. Here was the perfect testbed for Gunn's illegal miracles. Kenney called his commanders in on 28th of February and briefed them himself. He was not a man for decoration. His orders were clean and cold. Find the convoy, mass every aircraft we can spare, and when you strike to annihilate. No token passes, no harassment. You sink them, you sink all of them. So the Allies built a layered hammer, high-altitude B-17, flying fortresses to rattle the convoy, force course changes, make the Japanese steam in zigzags, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, low and fast, to rake the decks. P-38 Lightnings to tangle with the Zeros and keep them off the strikers. And, at the heart, the new B-25 Strafers, the nose-heavy, gun-snarling Mitchells that Gunn and his mechanics had birthed in tropical hangars. It would be, by the calendar of that theater, the largest coordinated airblow yet thrown. While Allied pilots rehearsed, on a derelict hulk, practicing their runs, their release points, their timings, the Japanese convoy eased out of Simpson Harbor at midnight as ordered. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the destroyer Shirayuki and looked over what was, on paper, an impressive armada. Transports Kyokawa Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Aiyo Maru, Taimei Maru, Shinai Maru, Oigawa Maru. American sources mangled some of those names, but the tonnage was real. Destroyers Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikanami, and Asagumo riding shotgun. About 100 Zeros pledged to top cover at various legs of the trip. Kimura was no fool. He expected losses. Every run to New Guinea in early '43 had cost hulls. But the Japanese calculation was simple. If enough ships got through, the mission was a success. It was a wartime logic born of necessity. They did not yet know the equations had changed. A B-24 on patrol spotted the formation that same afternoon and radioed back the essentials: course, speed, number of ships. The Pacific being the Pacific, weather tried to shield the Japanese. 2 tropical storms rolled through, smearing the horizon, laying down rain curtains and scudding cloud decks. For a few hours, Allied aircraft could only shadow, not strike. The convoy plowed on at about 7 knots, call it 8 miles per hour. Slow because the transports, stuffed with troops and equipment, could not go faster. The escorting destroyers, sleek gray knives of the Imperial Navy, could have leapt ahead at 20 knots or more, but convoys only move as fast as the slowest hull. Through March 1st, the seas were rough, the holds were crowded, and hundreds of Japanese soldiers greened with seasickness. On the morning of March 2nd, the sky lifted a little. Visibility improved. Allied long-range patrols reacquired the convoy. At around 10 a.m., 29 B-17s from medium altitude came in and did what B-17s could do in the Pacific: drop a lot of bombs, score very few hits. Their attack was not heroic, so much as stubborn. Japanese records later showed maybe a transport had been nicked, but the real effect was different. The convoy had to turn, to weave, to throw off the aim. Every turn robbed them of speed. Every zigzag stretched the time they were exposed. Throughout the day, more B-17s came, like a drummer beating time. It was harassment, yes, but it was also shepherding, pushing the Japanese convoy into the zone where the real blow would land the next morning. Up above, Zeros tumbled with the bombers. Some B-17s came back with holes in them. At least 3 Japanese fighters did not come back at all, but no ship sank. Dusk fell on March 2nd, with tension thick on both sides. The Japanese could smell land, still maybe 30 nautical miles from Leh. Kimura might have felt relief. Coastal guns could soon lend a hand. But he might also have felt, as good sailors do, that prickling at the back of the neck, the knowledge that clear weather at dawn would make them naked. Meanwhile, at Cape Ward Hunt on Papua's northern shore, Allied crews were up before first light, warming engines, checking guns that had been harmonized to the last fraction, loading bombs with delayed fuses, listening to final briefings from Major Ed Larner. Allied sources often render it Ed Larner, or Ed Larner, Shier, Larner. What mattered was his grasp of low-level tactics. They had practiced over and over, running mock attacks on a wreck, timing their drops, flying in echelons that would hit the convoy from multiple levels and bearings. This was no improvisation now. This was choreography. March 3rd, 1943, broke clean. Clear skies, good visibility, sea running calm. Perfect for the attackers, terrible for the attacked. The Allied strike force lifted off in waves, first the high-cover fighters, then the medium-altitude bombers, then the killers. Radar and scouts vectored them in. Out at sea, the Japanese column steamed on, funnels trailing, lookouts scanning that immaculate sky. Then, all at once, the horizon began to sprout wings. What followed would be remembered as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. But for the men in those low B-25s, it was a 10-second test of everything Paul Gunn had argued in oily hangars months earlier, of whether an angry captain's illegal gunships could break a convoy that Tokyo had staked thousands of lives on. And somewhere, out over the water, as the first Mitchell dove, 8 muzzles blazing, you could almost hear the war tilt. Approximately 90 Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese convoy that morning, a sky-wide hammer forming over the Bismarck Sea, and from the first minute the attack did not feel like an air raid, it felt like judgment. The opening blow, just after 10 a.m., came from the high boys, the B-17 flying fortresses, droning in from medium altitude, huge and deliberate, dropping strings of bombs that forced the ships below to turn again, keep turning, because that was their purpose, not precision, but disruption. Those bombers were the waving hand, meant to make every Japanese lookout and gun crew stare upward, to break formation, to slow the convoy, to make them bleed speed, so the real killers coming in low would find ships broadside, not racing away. The sea below erupted in tall white pillars as the convoy scattered across the water, destroyers weaving to shield the transports, wakes crossing like frantic brushstrokes on a blue canvas. And just as the Japanese captains were shouting for new headings, there they came, the low-altitude attackers. First in were the RRAAF Beaufighters, big twin-engine brutes carrying 4 20mm cannon in the nose and 6 303s in the wings. They came in almost at wave top, engines howling, sunlight flashing off canopies, and they did exactly what they had been sent to do, strip the convoy of its eyes and teeth. They raked the decks of the escorting destroyers with slashing, downward-walking bursts. Anti-aircraft guns that had swung up toward the B-17s were suddenly ripped sideways, crews cut down behind their shields, rangefinders shattered. Japanese guns opened up with everything, 25mm, 13mm, even rifles. But the closing speed was too great. By the time a gunner got his sights on a Beaufighter, the aircraft was already past, tracers buried in the sea behind it. That was the moment the slaughter began. Because right behind the Beaufighters, like a second wave in a storm surge, came the modified B-25 Strafers, Paul Gunn's illegal monsters, heavy in the nose, snarling with 8 forward-firing 50s, flying not like medium bombers, but like oversized fighters drunk on horsepower and vengeance. Each one picked a target and came in on a run so low the prop wash flung spray across the windscreen. One pilot locked onto the transport Kyokusei Maru and dropped his nose to about 50 feet above the water, a height where a single mistimed swell could have killed him, and at 1,000 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 8 Brownings came alive at once. That's 6,800 rounds per minute, about 180 pounds of metal per second, and every tracer made visible the path of his fury. You could have painted the ship with it. The fire started at the bow, stitched its way along the foredeck, smashed into superstructure, tore open wheelhouse windows, blew gunners backward before they could even swing their mounts. Men who had been leaning over railings, scanning for aircraft, simply vanished in sprays of splinters and steel. Anti-aircraft guns that might have gotten off a few rounds were beaten flat, shields bent, ammunition lockers popped open by machine gun impacts. The bridge of Kyokusei Maru disintegrated under that storm. Glass, wood, and bodies whipped away in fragments. And only when the ship was properly blinded did the pilot release his bombs, 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses, dropped at about 200 yards, the perfect skip bomb range. They hit the water, bounced, 1, 2, like stones thrown by an angry god, and struck just below the waterline amidships. The B-25 was already banking hard away when the delayed detonations went off underwater. 2 deep, muffled thuds rose through the hull and burst outward. The bottom of the transport was torn open, as if a giant hand had ripped out floorboards. Kyokusei Maru lurched, rolled slightly to port, then began to settle with that awful, slow inevitability of wounded ships. In less than 15 minutes, she would be gone. But there was no time to watch her sink, because the other B-25s were already in. Each came in on its own lane, disciplined but merciless, and each replayed the same attack profile that Gunn and Kenny had dreamed up in Australian hangars. Guns first, bombs second. The transport Kembu Maru took it perhaps worst of all. At least 3 B-25s hit her in succession. The first strafing run killed or wounded nearly every crewman topside. Gun positions were smashed flat. A second aircraft laid fire right along this starboard rail, shredding boats, cutting signal halyards, starting small fires. Then bombs, 4 of them, skipped in and slammed below the waterline. With compartments already open from machine gun damage, the flooding was catastrophic. The ship broke, literally broke, the hull flexing until she folded in on herself and sank in under 10 minutes. Another transport, Teo Maru, was hit so hard by converging strafing runs that fires erupted across the superstructure like a line of matches being lit. 2 bombs tore open her hull. She started to go down with nearly 1,000 troops, Japan's hard-won, carefully trained infantry, still trapped below decks. Nojima tried to maneuver. Her captain ordered hard turns, trying to throw off the aim of the attackers, but a B-25 came straight down her axis, raked her from stern to bow so viciously that topside crew simply disappeared behind sprays of plating, then dropped 2 skip bombs into the engine room area. The ship lost power at once, a fatal wound for a vessel under air attack. She would go down later in the day, but her fate was sealed in that pass, and it was not only the fat, slow transports that suffered. The Allied pilots knew that to finish the convoy, they had to cut away its teeth. So Beaufighters and B-25s turned their guns on the destroyers themselves. Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's own flagship, was hit by screaming, low-level strafing that swept the bridge clean. Accounts differ on the exact moment, but what is clear is that many of the officers on the bridge, including Kimura, were killed or badly wounded in seconds. A bomb struck near the stern and touched off a magazine fire. Secondary explosions walked up the hull. The entire aft section was shattered, and the destroyer began to die, stern first, fire rolling out over the sea. Tokitsukaze took bombs that reached her fuel. She became, in the words of one Allied pilot, a moving furnace. And she, too, went under. Arashio, trying to maneuver in the chaos, collided with the transport Nojima and was so heavily damaged she had to be abandoned. All this time, Japanese Zero fighters were clawing at the sky, trying to break through. But the P-38 Lightnings were there, high cover, fast, and high climbing enough to grab the Zeros before they could dive on the low-level attackers, and the B-25s themselves were too low for the Japanese fighters to engage without risking collision with masts or hitting their own ships. It was one of those rare operations where the timing, altitudes, headings, everything lined up. From the first attack run to the moment the last B-25 pulled away to head back for fuel and ammunition, roughly 40 minutes had passed. 40 minutes. And the Japanese convoy was no longer a convoy. It was a burning, drifting scatter of wrecks. 4 transports were sinking or already gone. 3 destroyers lay beneath the waves or were in their death throes. The rest of the ships, those that could still move, were running. In different directions. Some toward Leh, some away from the attack, all of them wounded. The sea itself had turned ugly, oil slicks spreading black wings over the water, cargo and planking, and bodies bobbing in the swells. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors thrashed in the oil, clinging to wreckage, some waving, some too stunned to do even that. But the day was not over. The Allies came back in the afternoon, rearmed, refueled, now with the advantage of attacking a foe already broken. The modified B-25s and other aircraft hunted survivors like hounds working a field. They picked off stragglers, finished crippled transports, and found the damaged destroyer Asashio. Already hurt from the morning's action, she could not outrun or outgun the attackers. More bombs hit. She, too, rolled and went under. By nightfall on 3rd of March 1943, the arithmetic of the battle was brutal and simple. All 8 Japanese transports sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers sunk. Of the 6,900 troops who had set out from Rabaul, more than 5,700 were dead, drowning, or rescued without equipment. Only about 1,200 men would actually reach Leh, many of them without rifles, without packs, stripped of heavy weapons. A convoy that had been meant to save Japan's position in New Guinea had been shattered in a single day by 90 aircraft. Allied losses were light enough to feel unreal. 1 B-17, 3 P-38s, 13 airmen killed. In Washington and Brisbane, commanders understood at once what had just happened. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, because that was the name it would be given, had proven something air power advocates had argued since the 1920s, but few had seen so cleanly on film or in after-action reports. Land-based aircraft, properly armed and properly handled, could annihilate a heavily escorted convoy at sea. It validated everything Kenny had gambled on, and everything Paul "Pappy" Gunn had risked his career to build. It also forced Tokyo to face a reality it had avoided. After Bismarck Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again tried a major troop convoy to New Guinea in daylight. They switched to smaller runs, to barges hugging the coast, to night deliveries. But the big, proud, top-heavy transports, those were gone. Too vulnerable, too expensive, too likely to die under a curtain of American tracers. General MacArthur, never shy about shaping a narrative, issued a communique claiming 22 ships destroyed, 3 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and more than 12,000 enemy dead. The numbers were inflated, wartime theater, but the truth underneath needed no makeup. The Japanese had been mauled. The road to Leh, and beyond Leh to Salamaua, and beyond that to the eventual neutralization of Rabaul, had been cleared not by battleships, but by low-level bombers, dreamed up in a hot hangar by a man angry enough to break rules. And what did it mean for Gunn? Sitting in Australia, listening to reports, seeing reconnaissance photos of burning ships, reading intelligence summaries of drowned soldiers, he must have felt that tight, hard satisfaction of a man who had bet everything on unorthodox thinking and won. His nose-gun B-25s had not only worked, they had changed the campaign. But the victory was not clean for him. His wife and 4 children were still behind wire in Santa Thomas in Manila. The men he had killed that day could not buy them freedom. So he went back to work. Success breeds expansion. Kenny ordered every B-25 in theater converted to Strafer configuration. Gunn trained more crews, wrote up procedures, refined mounts, sped up the production flow. Word of what he had done reached North American aviation in the United States. Factory engineers came to see the field modifications, and, in a reversal rare for wartime bureaucracy, decided to copy the soldier instead of correcting him. Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to work with the company at Englewood in Kansas City to turn field hacks into factory models. The result was the B-25G, then the even more fearsome B-25H, gunships with cannon and multiple .50s built in from the start. The air war in the Pacific had bent around one man's insistence that bombers could bite. And out over the Bismarck Sea, long after the last Allied plane had turned for home, the waves kept rocking against blackened hulls, tapping gently at steel that would never sail again. It began with an airplane that looked impossible. 1,000 B-25H gunships rolled out with a 75mm cannon in the nose and 14 50 caliber machine guns scattered across nose, cheeks, turret, and waist. An airborne fist made of aluminum and anger. On paper, it was overarmed, nose-heavy, a pilot's nightmare. In the air, in the steaming Pacific, where Japanese convoys hugged jungle coasts and airstrips were ringed with guns, it was exactly what the war needed. The H model moved the dorsal turret forward to help balance all that steel up front, and to save weight, the co-pilot's seat was sacrificed. Now the navigator doubled as the cannon loader, reaching forward between attacks to slam another round into the chamber like a stoker feeding a boiler. It was crude, it was dangerous, but it worked. At Wright Field, the Army Air Force's development men, good men, careful men, read the weight and balance sheets and blanched. They cabled the Southwest Pacific. This configuration is unsafe. Aircraft should be grounded until center of gravity problems are corrected, and somewhere in New Guinea or Australia, where the hangars smelled of dope, oil, and damp canvas. The answer that history remembers, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, was the one that sounded like Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight. That sentence, whether he said it exactly or not, was the essence of him. Technical purity could wait. Men were dying now. If a pilot had to lean on the yoke a little harder on takeoff, so be it. The pilots adapted. They learned to fly the nose-heavy beast, to bring it in low, to fire in short, disciplined bursts, so recoil didn't yank the nose offline. They learned to respect the cannon's kick and the heat of 1450s firing at once. And while they learned, production surged. The final great wartime variant, the B-25J, came in like a tide, 4,318 aircraft, the most numerous Mitchell of the war. Some J models went back to a glass bombardier nose for more traditional missions, but many kept the Strafer configuration: solid nose, 850s forward, cheek guns, upper turret locked to fire ahead. A few ended up with 2 waist guns and tail guns as well. In its most brutal form, a Mitchell could carry up to 18 50 caliber machine guns. 18. No other bomber in World War II carried that much close-in firepower. Was all of it strictly necessary? Of course not. But that was hardly the point. In the jungles and island chains of the Southwest Pacific, the sight, really the sound, of a B-25 coming in at mast height was enough to make Japanese troops dive for any hole they could find. The 2 Wright R-2600 radials had a particular thunder when the pilot shoved the throttles forward, and after 1943, men on the other side of the lines learned that when that sound drew near, it almost always brought a sheet of American tracers with it. Throughout 1943 and 1944, those modified Mitchells became a plague on Japanese logistics. They were the long arm of MacArthur's island-hopping promise, the reason isolated garrisons starved and airfields stayed cratered. In August 1943, they hit Wewak on the north coast of New Guinea, an operation that has never had the fame of Midway or D-Day, but to the pilots who flew it, it was a masterpiece of applied air power. Japanese intelligence had packed Wewak and nearby Borum with aircraft. Fighters, bombers, float planes, hundreds of them, carefully dispersed, revetted, but still on the ground. Range was the problem. Wewak was right at the edge of what a B-25 could safely reach and return from. Gunn, who by then seemed to view every design limitation as a personal insult, improvised yet again. He hung auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay, ugly fume-leaking drums. Crews flew out, breathing gasoline, blow-through air coming from the open bay doors once the fuel was gone and the tanks were shoved out. It was crude as farm machinery. It bought them hundreds of extra miles, and once they were there, the B-25 Strafers did what they had been built to do. They came in low, guns first, flattening anti-aircraft positions, ripping into parked aircraft, and then bombed with parafrags, small parachute-retarded bombs that dropped almost straight down and tore aircraft to pieces without needing a direct hit. In 2 days of hammering, Allied aircraft destroyed or badly damaged 170-plus Japanese planes on the ground. That was the end of Japanese air superiority over New Guinea. From then on, Allied ground forces could move under their own umbrella, not the enemy's. A few months later, in November 1943, the modified B-25s went after Rabaul itself. Now, Rabaul was no backwater strip. It was the fortress anchoring Japanese power in the Bismarck archipelago. Heavy anti-aircraft, fighters, ships in harbor, revetments, radar, the works. For years after the war, veterans would say, if you could fly over Rabaul, you could fly over anything. On that day, Major Raymond Jock Hennebree, often rendered Henterberry in garbled accounts, led 38 B-25s in at mast height. P-38, Lightnings rode shotgun above. Smoke pots and phosphorus bombs laid a screen to blind the worst of the flak, and the Mitchells went straight for the harbor, this time not for a convoy, but for ships sitting brazenly at anchor because the Japanese still didn't quite believe medium bombers could do what fighters did. Of the 38 vessels in the harbor, 30 were hit. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, a string of transports and auxiliaries, all struck, many set on fire or sunk outright. Rabaul, which Imperial planners like to think of as a forward offensive base, was suddenly on the defensive, and it would never fully recover its swagger. That raid, as much as any naval action, helped bottle up Rabaul so it could be bypassed. Classic Allied strategy in the theater: don't storm every fortress, just cut it off, let it wither. And what cut it off? Aircraft like the ones Pappy Gunn had built. In 1944, when MacArthur kept his promise and turned back toward the Philippines, the B-25 Strafer was still there, still low, still mean. They scoured the Visayan Sea, the Sulu Sea, the waters around Leyte and Luzon, hammering service craft, barges, coastal vessels, even small freighters. They shredded Japanese supply columns on Luzon roads, tore into airstrips, and dove in behind advancing American infantry like guard dogs. Filipino civilians who watched those attacks from sugar fields and towns started calling them something like bats out of hell, here 1 second, gone the next, leaving wreckage and smoke. By then, everyone in the theater knew whose fingerprints were on those airplanes. But Gunn's war was always lived in two layers. On the surface, he was the Southwest Pacific's miracle tinkerer, the man who could make a bomber do things no bomber had ever done. Underneath, he was a husband and father whose family was still locked away at Santo Tomas in Manila, living under Japanese occupation, getting thinner and sicker as the war dragged on. Occasionally, through the Red Cross, a letter would reach him, carefully censored, stiff with worry, but he knew what Japanese camps were like in 1944. He knew food was running low, that guards grew harsher as defeat drew near, and he knew, cruelest knowledge of all, that nothing he did with an aircraft wrench in Australia could feed his children that day. All he could do was speed the end. In late 1944, on Leyte, he was still flying, 45 years old, right arm and shoulder already battered from years of service, and still he went up. One night, Japanese bombers hit Tacloban airfield with white phosphorus bombs. One burst close, fragments ripped into Gunn's shoulder and tore up muscle and nerve. It was a bad wound, the kind that leaves an arm cold, heavy, barely responsive. He was evacuated to Australia and spent months recovering. For most men, that would have been the curtain call. For Gunn, it was just the pause before the part of the story that actually mattered to him. Because on February 3rd, 1945, a flying column of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, moving fast through burning Manila, reached Santo Tomas just as Japanese guards were preparing to kill camp leaders. The cavalry broke in. Over 4,000 internees were freed. American, British, Filipino, Dutch. Among them, Polly Gunn and her 4 children. 3 years and 14 days in captivity. 3 years of hunger, fear, and waiting. They were still there. They were still alive. General Douglas MacArthur himself stopped by the camp shortly afterward. This was the human payoff to his "I shall return," and he knew it. He arranged for the Gunn family to be flown to Australia. And sometime in February, weeks after that liberation, in a quiet moment far from the front, a man who had once been forced to lift off from Manila without his wife and children finally saw them again. Imagine that scene in your head. Not a parade, not bands, not medals, just a thin woman who has held 4 children together through occupation, disease, and shortages, and a gaunt, older pilot whose shoulder still aches, arms outstretched. The kids are taller now. The boys, Paul Jr. and Nathan, have the hard look of camp survivors. The girls, Connie and Julie, are different too. Still young, but old in the eyes. They are a family again, but not the same family that had lived in Manila in 1941. War had put shadows behind every smile. Gunn stayed on with the Army Air Forces after that. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, then medically retired as a full colonel on June 30th, 1948. He didn't stop working, men like him rarely do. He went back to the Philippines, helped rebuild Philippine Airlines, got airplanes flying between islands that had been cut off for years. The country was a scarred place then. Bridges blown, airfields cratered, buildings burned. But airplanes could knit the islands back together, and Gunn knew airplanes. He kept flying charters, kept pushing schedules, kept doing what he'd done since the 1920s. On October 11th, 1957, 7 days before his 58th birthday, he flew into a storm on a charter flight. The aircraft went down. After everything, Pearl Harbor's aftermath, the evacuation, the jungle crash, the strafing missions, the phosphorus wound. He died as he had lived, at the controls. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery, at Nass, Pensacola, Florida, the place where he had once taught young naval aviators how to fly, the place where his long, unlikely career had really begun. His ribbon rack by then was heavy, Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, 9 separate wounds in one war, plus the campaign ribbons of a man who had been everywhere in the Southwest Pacific. But his real monument was not metal on his chest. It was aluminum in the air. Almost 900 B-25 Mitchells were built during the war, and thousands of those flew in Strafer or semi-Strafer configuration because field workshops in New Guinea proved it could be done. Skip bombing, once a theory talked about in 1920s classrooms, became combat doctrine because he and George Kenney pushed it. Japanese shipping in the Bismarck Sea and around New Guinea lay on the bottom because of airplanes he had reimagined. And every time, even years later, a veteran of the Southwest Pacific heard recordings of a Mitchell's engines spooling up, you could almost see it in his face. That memory of a low, fast shape thundering over green water, guns winking, leaving only spray and smoke in its wake. It started with a truth the big headquarters in Washington never liked to say out loud. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that one angry, grieving aviator in a hot, corrugated tin hangar could change the outcome of a whole theater of war. Not a board, not a committee, not a factory drawing stamped approved, but a man who had lost his family to an enemy camp and therefore stopped accepting the word impossible. From that day in March 1943, every serious staff officer, American or Japanese, had to face the same arithmetic. Air power, when it was fed the right intelligence and married to the right weapon, could erase a convoy in minutes. 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost, more than 5,000 men killed or drowned or denied to the battlefield in exchange for 4 Allied aircraft. That was not a fight, that was an equation. And the equation said, if the enemy owns the sky, the sea is a killing floor. Nothing on the surface can live there for long. That was the quiet revolution Pappy Gunn had helped ignite. He had shown that when you give a medium bomber the teeth of a fighter, the reach of a patrol aircraft, and the punch of a torpedo plane, when you let it come in low and fast and mean, it can do the work of 3 different squadrons at once. A single B-25 Strafer could range hundreds of miles out from New Guinea or the northern coast of Australia, find a Japanese column trying to sneak along the coast, level out at mast height, rake the decks until every gun crew was on the floor, and then skip a bomb into the softest part of the hull. One pass, one ship gone, crew scattered in oily water. Then the Mitchell climbed away, circled, and if fuel allowed, did it again. You could not run a maritime empire under that kind of sky. Tokyo learned that lesson, but much too late. After the Bismarck Sea disaster, the Japanese Navy did not suddenly become timid. It became realistic. Big daytime convoys were over. As long as Allied airfields at Port Moresby, Milne Bay, Dobodura, Nadzab, or later in the Admiralties could launch low-level strike aircraft, any large formation of transports was a suicide note. So the Japanese did what cornered commanders have always done. They went to night, to the shadows, to the margins. They sent destroyers on high-speed rat runs. They used submarines to carry the more precious cargo. And in the shallow, mangrove-choked waters of New Guinea, they began pushing barges, small, low, hard to spot from altitude. It was sensible, it was adaptive, and it was not enough, because the B-25s adapted too. Crews started flying at dusk and dawn, those gray times when the sea and the sky blur together. Radar sets, primitive by later standards but good enough, were lashed into the bombers. Night B-25s prowled coastlines, picking up specks of moving metal where no ship was supposed to be, dropping flares, then diving in. Daylight barges tried to hug the tree line, hiding in river mouths, tying up under overhanging branches. The Strafers came right down the slot, guns winking, chopping men and cargo off decks, and leaving the barges sinking sideways into muddy water. That was the stranglehold. Not dramatic like Midway, not a single decisive naval gun duel, but month after month of relentless interdiction until Japanese garrisons in New Guinea, in the Bismarck Archipelago, in western New Britain, in the Solomons, and later in the Philippines, were really just pockets of hungry men with rifles, brave, loyal, but starving and out of ammunition. Courage could not refill a magazine. Bushido did not move rice. By 1945, in the Southwest Pacific, air superiority, won and held by modified medium bombers like Gunn's B-25s, made Japanese courage almost irrelevant. That is a hard thing to say, and a harder thing to hear if you respect the men on the other side, but it is what the Japanese themselves wrote afterward. Post-war interrogations and memoirs by Imperial Navy officers admitted the psychological punch of those low-level attacks. After March 1943, convoy commanders knew that within range of Allied land bases, no amount of zigzagging or smoke would guarantee safety. We could not answer such attacks, some of them said, because to answer, you had to see the enemy coming, and the Strafers were on you in seconds. That is why historians in Britain, in Australia, in the United States, still use the Bismarck Sea as a teaching case. It was intelligence, Fremantle and Melbourne reading Japanese signals. It was coordination, B-17s high, Beaufighters low, P-38s top cover, B-25s in the slot, and it was weapon innovation. All three. Miss one and the convoy gets through. Hit all three and you sink it for the cost of a training accident. And the airplane that made that possible, the upgunned, low-flying, bomb-skipping B-25, was born not in an aircraft company boardroom, but in a dusty hangar where a former Navy chief with a broken heart was bolting salvaged 50 cals into a medium bomber's nose. That's the part officers in peacetime always forget. In war, the front line often outruns the manual. By late '43, the B-25 Strafer was everywhere in MacArthur's area. It flew with RAAF crews, with U.S. Army Air Forces squadrons, with composite groups that had Dutch or Filipino personnel attached. It escorted the Japanese surrender delegation in August 1945. Think about that. The same kind of aircraft that had wrecked Japanese convoys in 1943 now shepherded Japanese officers through Pacific skies to sign the documents that ended it. That is poetic symmetry, and I don't believe in coincidences of that size. When the war ended, professional airmen did what they always do. They studied. In Maxwell Field classrooms, in RAF staff colleges, in French and Dutch and Swedish air schools, officers looked at the reports from New Guinea and said, so a medium bomber can be a gunship. So skip bombing, when combined with suppression, can be decisive. So flexible, unauthorized field mods can change a theater. Those three so statements would not stay buried. 20 years later, when another jungle war flared in Southeast Asia, an old idea came back in a new airframe. This time, it wasn't a B-25, it was a C-47, an unarmed cargo plane in peacetime, a humble Goonie bird. Somebody in Vietnam said, what if we filled the port side with guns and circled a target, hosing down the tree line? AC-47 Spooky was born. After that came the AC-119, then the AC-130. Big, heavy, side-firing gunships circling over trails at night, pounding trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Different war, different decade, but the logic line is straight. Forward-firing firepower, plus low-altitude attack, plus persistence. Ships sunk, trucks burned, enemy movement paralyzed. That line begins in the American story, with Pappy Gunn. And yet, as always, the metal outlived the man. Of the 9,090 B-25 Mitchells built, more than 100 still survive. Many are in museums, some still fly. If you go to Dayton, the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, you can stand under one. The wings are broader than you remember from photos. The fuselage is tall enough that a man can stand upright in it. The nose, on the Strafer versions, is all business. No elegant greenhouse, just a blunt, armored snout, with gun ports staring straight ahead like the barrels of a ship's secondary battery. In Pensacola, at the National Naval Aviation Museum, where Gunn once wore a flight suit and taught youngsters to fly, there's another Mitchell. The Smithsonian has one. When they crank those surviving radials over at air shows, when the props blur and the R-2600s settle into that chest-deep rumble, you can watch the older men in the crowd. Some of them close their eyes. Some of them tilt their heads, as if listening not just to this airplane but to another one, lower over green water, guns flashing. At a few shows, they even fire the forward guns with blanks. When they do, the whole airplane shudders. You can see the recoil ripple through the nose. You can smell powder. For a second, you get what a Japanese destroyer's lookout saw in 1943, a low American twin, silver and green, hammering straight in no matter how hard the ship's captain throws the wheel over. Those museums are more than collections of hardware. They are memory made solid. Each B-25 on a polished floor is telling the same story. A nation at war was willing to listen to a man who said, "This will work, even if the book says no." General George Kenney understood that before most. When he published The Saga of Pappy Gunn in 1959, he wasn't just praising an old comrade. He was making sure the bureaucracy couldn't erase a field innovator from the official version. Kenney flat out wrote that Gunn was one of the most important individuals in the Pacific War. That is a big statement from a theater air commander, but he meant it. Because he had watched those modified Mitchells save ships, save infantry battalions, save whole operations from being strangled. Years later, Nathaniel Gunn, the youngest son, the boy who spent his teenage years in Santo Tomas, added the family's side. He wrote about camp life, about his mother keeping the children alive with nothing, about hearing later what their father had been doing in Australia. Then, in 1975, the Air Force quietly, finally, put Gunn's name on a training facility. Not a battlefield monument, not a statue on a horse, just a place where young airmen learn how to do things right. That was fitting. Gunn never cared about parades. He cared about a bomber that could get the job done. And that, really, is the lesson that still matters for anyone who studies logistics, air power, or just plain human stubbornness. Innovation does not always come from the design bureau. Sometimes it comes from a man who refuses to accept that his family will stay behind barbed wire one day longer than necessary. Sometimes it comes from the shop floor, from hands scarred by safety wire and gunpowder. Sometimes it is born out of grief. The B-25 Strafer did not win World War II on its own. No single weapon did. Victory in the Pacific was a cathedral built by millions. Shipyard workers on the West Coast, farmers in Iowa, Seabees in the Gilberts, Marines on Peleliu, sailors at Leyte, codebreakers in Melbourne, B-29 crews over the home islands. But the Strafer was one of those odd, brilliant stones that holds more weight than its size would suggest. It punched far above its tonnage. It turned the sea into a hostile place for Japan. It shortened the road back to Manila. And, in the end, it did the one thing its creator wanted most. It helped pry open a camp gate on Luzon so that a wife and 4 children could walk out into sunlight again. While somewhere far away, a museum B-25 sat in the quiet, smelling faintly of oil and old victories.